Cedar smoke and something underneath it. Wet fur, old blood. The particular sourness of meat left too long in a warm place. Garrett crouched at the edge of the pit he had dug 3 autumns ago and studied what remained of his winter stores. Not much. Something had torn through the hide cover, clawed apart the wooden frame, pulled out the salted rabbit, the smoked venison strips, and half the dried fish he had spent 3 days curing over slow coals in October. Claw marks scored the frame in deep parallel grooves. The dirt around the pit was churned into frozen chaos. Prints pressed deep into the mud, he muttered, tracing the edges with one finger. But the prints were wrong for Coyote. Too narrow, too long in the toe, and coyotes did not stack bones. Whatever had raided his cache had piled the bones in a neat row beside the pit, smallest to largest, arranged with the deliberate care of someone keeping count. That is not an animal, Garrett said aloud. He did not talk to himself often. Living alone did that to a man. Words came out when no one was there to hear them, like pressure escaping a cracked pipe. 3 years on this mountain had taught him the sound of his own voice was the loneliest thing in the world, but sometimes the silence was worse. He followed the tracks north through scrub pine and frost-cracked rock. His cabin sat behind him in the valley, a thin line of smoke curling from the stone chimney he had built with his own hands the first summer. He had chosen this place for its emptiness. 10 miles to the nearest settlement, 14 to Coldwell, the town that had been his home for 22 years before it decided he was not welcome anymore. Nobody visited, nobody knew the trail. That was the point. The tracks led uphill, weaving between boulders, crossing a frozen creek bed where the ice was thick enough to hold a mule but thin enough to groan under a man's weight, and terminating at a granite outcrop where the hillside folded into a shallow overhang. Barely deep enough to block the wind, the kind of shelter an animal might use for a single night before moving on. Not the kind of place anything chose. The kind of place something ended up when every other option had been exhausted. Inside the overhang, curled into a space no bigger than a feed sack, was a child. Orc, 5 years old, maybe 6, skin the color of wet slate smeared with ash and dried mud, barefoot, ribs visible through a torn leather shirt that might have fit properly once but now hung like a flag on a broken pole, fingers cracked and purple at the tips. The particular purple that came before black, before the flesh died and the bone underneath gave up. His hair was matted against his skull. His feet were raw. He smelled like smoke and earth and the particular bitterness of a body consuming itself because there was nothing else to consume. Garrett crouched at the entrance and held very still. Hey! The child's eyes snapped open. Yellow-green wild, the pupils blown wide enough to swallow the iris. The growl that came from his throat was not a sound children were supposed to make. It belonged to something cornered and desperate, something that had learned the hard way that every large shape in the doorway meant pain. Easy, Garrett said. I am not gonna hurt you. The child lunged, teeth first, small and sharp, and driven by a fury that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with terror. Garrett hissed as they sank through his coat sleeve and found skin. He pulled back instinct, overriding patience, and the child scrambled deeper into the overhang, with his lips peeled back and his small fists raised like weapons. The growl continued, low, steady, not a warning, a boundary. All right, Garrett said, gripping his bleeding arm. So we are doing it that way. He sat down at the entrance, cross-legged, bleeding, making no move to reach inside. The wind cut across the hillside and found every gap in his coat, every seam that had loosened over 3 winters of hard use. His arm throbbed where the teeth had broken skin. He pressed his sleeve against the wound and waited. The blood was warm for a moment, then cold. Everything got cold up here eventually. You ate my fish, he said conversationally. The smoked stuff. Took me 3 days to cure that over the pit. 3 days of turning strips and feeding coals and keeping the raccoons away, and you went through it in one night. Nothing from the overhang. The growl had stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse. It was the silence of something deciding whether the shape in the doorway was going to leave or whether the next step was fighting. And you stacked the bones. That was polite. Strange but polite. Most things that raid a cache just scatter what they do not eat. You lined them up like you were keeping inventory. Silence. Wind. The creak of a pine bending under ice weight somewhere up the ridge. I'm going to leave some food here. Bread and jerky. When I am gone, you eat it. Tomorrow I will come back with more. That is the deal. He pulled a cloth bundle from his pack, set it carefully at the entrance where the child could reach it without leaving cover, and backed away. Slow, deliberate, the way you moved around something wild that might bolt or bite depending on which instinct fired first. The child did not move until Garrett was 20 paces out. Then a small hand darted forward, snatched the bundle, and vanished into the dark of the overhang. Fast. Practiced. The grab of someone who had learned that food left in the open did not stay in the open for long. Garrett walked home with blood running down his wrist and a feeling in his chest he had not experienced in 3 years. The inconvenient awareness that something nearby needed him alive. The cold deepened overnight. Temperature dropped hard enough to turn the mud paths into cracked porcelain that crunched under his boots at dawn. Garrett followed the same routine he had kept for 3 years. Stove first, water second, coffee third. He drank it black, sitting in the only chair facing the only window, watching the valley fill with gray light that never quite became bright. The window had no curtain. He had considered hanging one once in the first year and then realized there was nobody to see in and nobody to see out. The glass was his only company in the mornings. It showed him his own reflection, and most days that was more company than he wanted. The cabin was built for one person and one purpose: endurance. A cot along the east wall, a cast iron stove he had salvaged from an abandoned mining camp 12 miles north, dragging it on a sled through 2 days of rain, because the alternative was another winter with an open fire and smoke that never quite found the chimney hole. A shelf of canned goods, a workbench where he repaired traps and sharpened blades and occasionally carved things he never finished. No decoration, no second cup, no photograph, no letter. Do not need one, he had told of the supply trader who came through last autumn with coffee and salt and news from the lowlands. The trader had looked around the cabin with the expression people wore when they saw life stripped to its minimum and could not decide if it was sad or admirable. Garrett had seen the look before. He did not care which conclusion the man reached. He hiked to the overhang with more food: bread, jerky, a strip of salted pork wrapped in cloth. The pork was from his emergency supply, the food he'd kept sealed in wax for the deep weeks of February when the snow made the trap line impossible and the canned goods ran thin. Giving it away was not generosity. It was a calculation he had not consciously made but could not undo. The boy was starving. The pork existed. The distance between those two facts was too short to ignore. He set the food at the entrance and retreated to his 20-pace distance. Same deal, he called back. Eat, I will come back. On the way down, he passed the cache pit. More bones had been stacked during the night. The child had returned for whatever scraps remained, and again had arranged them in that precise, deliberate row. Smallest to largest, a new bone at the end, thin as a finger cleaned of every shred of meat. Garrett studied the line and felt something tighten behind his ribs. This was not random behavior. This was a mind holding itself together through order. A child alone in the cold keeping count of what he had consumed because counting was the only thing left that made sense. When everything else falls apart, you count what remains. Garrett knew this. He had counted his own supplies every night for the first year on the mountain, not because he needed to, but because the numbers were reliable in a way that people were not. Methodical little thief, Garrett said to the empty trail. His voice carried no anger. Third morning. Colder still. Ice filmed the water bucket thick enough that he had to crack it with a knife handle, and the cracks sent a sound through the cabin like a bone breaking. He packed a blanket with the food, this time a rolled wool bundle that smelled like wood smoke and the particular staleness of a cabin occupied by one man for too long. He had debated bringing it. The blanket was one of 3 he owned. Giving it away meant colder nights for himself. But the temperature was dropping in a way that said the mountain was done being patient, and a child in a rock overhang with no fire and no cover would not survive what was coming. Blanket, he said at the entrance. Temperature is dropping tonight. Worse than last night. This will help. Movement inside the overhang. A shuffling sound, the scrape of small limbs against stone. Then a voice. Small, cracked, barely human, as if the vocal cords had forgotten their purpose and were remembering it one syllable at a time. Trap. Garrett froze. His hand was still extended, the blanket resting on the rock. What? Trap. The child's face appeared at the edge of the overhang. His eyes were still wild, but something had shifted in them. Not trust. Something more like calculation. The look of someone running numbers on a situation that did not add up. You leave food. Food is trap. It is not a trap. All food is trap. Men leave food, then take. Take what? The child retreated into the dark. Conversation over. 4 words in a worldview that Garrett could not argue with because someone had made it true. Someone had taught this child, or the world had taught him, that every offered thing came with a price. That kindness was currency and the exchange rate was always your freedom. That the hand extending bread would eventually close into a fist. Garrett sat at the entrance for a long time. The wind found him again, pressing cold fingers through his collar, his sleeves the gap between his boots and his trouser cuffs. He thought about the word trap and what it meant coming from a mouth that small. A child who believed all food was bait. A child who stacked bones to keep himself sane and growled like a wounded animal because that was the only defense left when everything else had been taken. Somewhere behind that voice was a history, a specific sequence of events that had led a 5-year-old orc child to believe that a piece of bread was the first move in a game that ended with him losing something. He left the blanket and walked home. That night, the stove ticking, in the dark, the memory surfaced. It always did on cold nights. The cold had a way of pulling things out of the places where he had buried them, like frost-heaving stones to the surface of a field. You could push them down all summer, but winter always brought them back. Coldwell, the town meeting hall. November 3 years ago, the smell of wet coats and kerosene lamps and the particular tension of a room full of people who had already made up their minds before anyone opened their mouth. They will freeze out there, Garrett had said, standing at the front. His hands were black from the forge. He had come straight from the workshop because the vote had been called without warning, the way votes were called when the outcome was already decided and the process was just decoration. Not our problem, Mayor Leland replied from behind the oak table that served as his desk during meetings. Orcs do not belong here. There is a mother and 2 children and on the trade road. Passing through, they asked for one night. One night in the stable out of the wind. That is all. Passing through is how it starts. Then they stay. Then more come. I already told her no. Put it to a vote. The vote was 12-1. Garrett was the one. 12 hands raised to drive an orc woman and her 2 children into the November dark and 1 hand that stayed down. His, the blacksmith. The man who had made every hinge on every door in that hall. The man who had shod every horse, repaired every plow, forged every nail that held this town together. 1 hand against 12. Garrett refused to help drive them out. He stood in the doorway of his workshop while the rest of the town walked the orc woman and her children to the edge of the territory in the dark. He could hear the children from his doorway, not crying, making a sound that was worse than crying. The particular silence of children who had learned that noise drew attention, and attention drew pain. You are choosing orcs over your own people, the blacksmith's apprentice said. A boy of 19 named Harlan, who had learned his trade at Garrett's anvil, who had eaten at Garrett's table, who had called him sir for 4 years and meant it. I am choosing not to freeze a woman and her children. Same thing in this town. They burned his workshop 3 nights later. Nobody saw who did it. Nobody asked. The fire took the forge, the anvil, 30 years of tools, the iron stock he had been saving for spring orders, and the bench where his father had taught him to shape metal when he was 7 years old. Then they burned his house, the one he had built with his father, the one with the forge attached to the east wall where he had shaped iron since he was 15, gone in a single night. Orange light against the November sky. Nobody threw a punch. Nobody raised a voice. They just stopped seeing him. He walked through Coldwell like a ghost. People he had known for decades looked through him as if he were made of glass. Orc lover, the baker's wife said as he passed her on the main street. Not shouted, mentioned. The way you might mention the weather or the price of flour. A fact of nature. A thing that was simply true and did not require emotion. He became invisible in a town of 200. Left on a Tuesday. Nobody marked the day. He packed what he could carry on the mule he had bought with the last of his savings and walked north until the trails ended and the mountain began. 3 years. The only creature that had registered his existence in all that time was a feral orc child who bit him and called his bread a trap. Fair enough, Garrett said to the ceiling. Fair enough. The 4th morning, the overhang was empty. Blanket gone. Food eaten. Bones stacked in their row, a new addition at the end, longer than the others placed with the same deliberate precision. Garrett studied the empty hollow where the child had been and felt something drop in his stomach. The absence was louder than the growling had been. Where did you go? He murmured, scanning the ridge. The trees offered nothing, the wind offered less. A twig cracked behind him. Garrett shifted slowly the way he had learned to move around wildlife. No sudden gestures, no aggressive angles. Just a slow rotation of the body until his eyes found what his ears had already located. The child stood 10 paces back among the pines, wrapped in the wool blanket, bread in one fist, not growling, not baring his teeth, just standing there with the morning light catching the ash on his face and those yellow-green eyes watching Garrett with an intensity that belonged to someone much older. He had followed. Somehow in the night, or in the early gray of dawn, this child had left the overhang and tracked the trail back to the cabin and then back up again, and now stood in the forest like a ghost made of ash and wool and caution. "Morning," Garrett said, chewing. The child ate the bread in small, controlled bites, not wolfing it, rationing every mouthful the way someone who had been truly hungry learned to eat. Small bites lasted longer. Small bites tricked the stomach into thinking there was more. "You followed me up here." More chewing. No acknowledgement, no denial. "That is half a mile barefoot in this cold." The child held up one foot, raw. The sole cracked and bleeding in 3 places, the skin between the toes split from frost. He displayed it like a tool. Functional, not pitiable. A thing that hurt but still worked and therefore did not require sympathy. The gesture was so matter-of-fact that it broke something in Garrett's chest that he had thought was already broken. "I have boots," Garrett said. "Too big for you, but I can stuff them with cloth. Wrap them tight." The child lowered his foot. "Why?" "Because frostbite kills toes." "Why do you care about my toes?" "I do not know. I just do not want them falling off." Whatever arithmetic ran behind those yellow-green eyes, it came out favorable. The child took 3 steps closer, then stopped. Still 10 feet away, but 10 feet was closer than 20, and 20 was closer than the back of an overhang. Progress measured in the space between a fist and an open hand. "Ember," Garrett said. "What?" "That is what I am calling you. You are covered in ash, and you keep appearing out of nowhere like a spark that will not go out." "That is not my name." "What is your name?" The wind answered instead, bending the pines and carrying the smell of the snow from the higher ridges. The child said nothing. His real name was a thing he kept the way he kept himself, close, hidden, protected from anyone who might use it to reach him. "Ember it is then. It is a terrible name. You are welcome to correct me anytime." They walked back to the cabin in a formation that would have made a tracker laugh. Garrett in front the child, 15 paces behind, matching every stop and start with a shadow's delay. When Garrett paused to check a frozen branch across the trail, the shadow paused. When he moved again, the shadow followed. Not trust, surveillance. The child was not following Garrett. He was studying him the way a fox studies a clearing before deciding whether to cross it. At the cabin, Garrett opened the door and went inside, left the door open behind him. Wide open, the heat escaping into the cold morning air like an invitation that cost him something real. Every degree that left was a degree he would have to replace with wood he would have to split with an axe that needed sharpening. But the door stayed open. Ember stayed outside for an hour. Garrett made soup. Venison broth from the last of the smoked meat thickened with dried herbs and a handful of barley he had been saving for a day when soup seemed important. He set a bowl on the step outside the open door. Steam curled from the surface and disappeared into the cold air. He went back to his workbench, picked up a trap spring he had been meaning to repair for a week, and pretended to focus on it. His hands moved. His eyes stayed on the doorway. "He is still out there," Garrett said to the empty room, sitting next to a bowl of soup like it owes him money. When he checked later, the bowl was empty. The spoon placed across the rim. Neatly, precisely. The placement of someone who had been taught table manners before the world had taken the table away. Somewhere in this child's past, someone had shown him how to set a spoon across a bowl, and he had kept that one small piece of civilization through everything that followed. The detail hurt more than the bite had. At dusk, Ember came inside. He chose the corner farthest from Garrett, the one where the wall met the floor at an angle that created a small protected space, a wedge of shadow that could hold a body and hide it from anything coming through the door. He wrapped himself in the blanket and pressed his back against the logs. His eyes stayed half open through the night, not sleeping, not awake, existing in the gray space between where consciousness stayed just alert enough to run if the door opened wrong. Garrett fed the stove, ate, cleaned a trap, oiled a hinge. He did not perform kindness. He did not make a show of being safe. He did not soften his movements or lower his voice or do any of the things that people did when they were trying to convince someone they were harmless. He just existed in the same space as a child who had decided for reasons neither of them could name that this particular human was worth the risk of an open door. The first night, Ember slept 2 hours. Garrett counted by the stove. The second night was worse. The child woke, screaming at midnight, a raw animal sound that hit Garrett in the spine before his brain had time to process it. He was out of the cot and across the cabin in 3 strides. But Ember was already in the corner with his fists up and his teeth bared, trapped between sleep and whatever had followed him out of it. His eyes were open but not seeing. They were seeing something else. Something behind the cabin walls, behind the winter, behind the 3 years and the mountain and everything that separated now from then. "Hey!" Garrett crouched 3 feet away, hands open, voice low. "You are in my cabin. Nobody else is here. Just me. Just the stove. Listen, that sound is the stove. The ticking, that is what a safe room sounds like." The screaming dropped to a whimper. The fists stayed raised, small fists. 5 years of muscle and bone and fear compressed into 2 knots no bigger than walnuts. "I am going to sit right here, not touching you, just sitting." He sat on the floor, back against the wall. The stove ticked. Wind pressed against the shutters like something trying to get in. The cold found the gap under the door and slid across the floor toward them. Men came. Ember's voice was a thread, barely there, a sound made by a mouth that had forgotten how to make sounds and was trying to remember. "Burned everything." "I know. Mama hid me under branches, said do not move." "You did not move. 2 days. That is a long time for anyone. Longer for someone your size." The fire went away. Mama did not come back. Garrett's hands tightened on his knees. The stove ticked. The wind pushed. Outside, the temperature was falling towards something that would freeze standing water in minutes. "So you walked until I found food." "My food." "Your food." A pause. The whimper had stopped. The fists were still raised, but looser, now the fingers not quite curled. "It was not a trap." "No, it was not." "Why not? Why would you feed me and not want something?" Garrett thought about Coldwell, about the orc mother and her 2 children on the trade road, about standing in that meeting hall and saying they will freeze and hearing "not our problem" 12 times over from people he had known his entire life, about his workshop burning orange against the November sky, about his house, about walking through a town where he had delivered every door hinge, every fireplace grate, every iron bolt, and being seen by no one, about the baker's wife and the words she used, about the mule and the trail north and the 3 years of silence that followed, about this cabin and this stove and this floor and this child. "Because someone did not feed me once," he said, "and I remember how that felt." Ember's eyes closed, fully, for the first time since Garrett had found him. His breath evened, his fists uncurled. Small fingers went limp against the blanket like flowers that had been holding themselves shut against the cold, and finally, in the presence of something warm, let go. Garrett sat on the coal floor for the rest of the night. His back ached. His knees stiffened. The cold worked its way through his clothes and into his bones. He did not move. Outside, a burned patch of hillside was growing back, wildflowers thickest where the fire had been worst. He had noticed it on a trap run last autumn, the way the charred ground produced more life than the soil that had never been touched. The botanists in the settlement had a word for it, but Garrett did not need the science. He had seen it with his own eyes. Ash makes the soil richer. Tonight, with a child breathing beside him who had crawled out of ashes, the thought returned and would not leave. Dawn came gray and heavy with the smell of coming snow. Garrett was outside before full light splitting kindling with the hand axe he kept by the door when something caught his eye. Boot prints, not his, fresh pressed into the frost near the tree line east of the cabin. Military pattern, deep tread, the kind of sole issued to territorial patrol units and the kind of men who bought surplus gear because it made them feel like soldiers without having to be one. Garrett knelt beside the nearest print. Clear edges, made within the last few hours, probably during the dead hours before dawn when the cold was worst and a man at a stove would not hear footsteps outside. Whoever had been here had stood at the tree line for some time. The prints clustered, shifted, moved left and right, like someone studying the cabin from multiple angles, watching, counting, making notes in their head about exits and entrances and the distance between the door and the tree line. Then they led back east and disappeared into the forest. Garrett stood. The hand axe hung at his side. His breath fogged the air. Behind him through the open door, he could hear embers shifting on the floor, the small sounds of a child waking into a room that was warm and still and contained no fire except the one in the stove. The prints were not animal. They were not orc. They were human and they were watching. He memorized their direction and said nothing to the child. Some fears were too heavy for a boy who had already carried more than any child should. Some fears belonged to the adults who could do something about them. The mule snorted 3 hours later. Sharp, urgent. The alarm that meant something unfamiliar had entered its range of awareness, something that did not belong to the mountain's usual catalog of sounds and smells. Garrett dropped the water bucket and turned toward the eastern tree line. 3 figures emerged from the trees, moving fast. On foot. No horses. They covered ground with the efficiency of people who had been walking for days and had stopped caring about stealth because exhaustion had burned away everything except the destination. They moved in formation. The fastest in front, the slowest in back, the middle one adjusting her pace to stay between them, a bridge between the first and the last. The first one was the tallest, broadest, braids whipping behind her in the wind, each one threaded with small bone beads that clicked as she ran. The sound carried across the clearing, a rapid percussion like teeth chattering or dice being thrown. She reached the cabin 30 seconds ahead of the others and did not slow. She hit the door with her shoulder and it exploded inward. The latch Garrett had built 3 years ago tore free from the frame. Wood splintered. The door slammed against the interior wall hard enough to crack the plaster he had applied last spring. Where is he? Garrett dropped the axe handle and ran. By the time he reached the doorway, the woman was inside. Spinning, scanning, a bone-handled knife in her grip held low blade, angled the grip of someone who had been taught to fight with a knife and had practiced enough that the teaching had become instinct. Her skin was dark green, darker than Ember's slate gray, and her eyes were black. Not dark brown, black like river stones worn smooth by decades of current. Eyes that had seen things and kept seeing them long after the things were gone. Ember was on his feet in the corner, wide-eyed, blanket clutched to his chest like armor. The woman screamed a name. Not Ember, a real name. Wren, a mother's name for her child, loaded with 4 days of searching and the specific terror of not knowing whether the search would end at a body or a grave or nothing at all. So that was his name. Wren. Garrett filed it away and let Ember go. The child did not move. His fingers tightened on the blanket. He did not run to her. He did not cry out. He stood in the corner with the expression of someone who had been found and was not sure yet whether being found was better than being hidden. What did you do to him? The woman rounded on Garrett. Black eyes, furious, exhausted, dark circles underneath that spoke of nights without sleep and days without stopping, the kind of exhaustion that lived in the muscle and the bone and would not leave for weeks even after the body stopped moving. She crossed the cabin in 2 strides and pinned him against the wall, her forearm pressed across his throat. The knife came up near his jaw, close enough that he could see the grain of the bone handle, close enough that he could see the nicks in the blade where it had met resistance before. What did you do to my son? Fed him. Garrett choked against the pressure on his windpipe. That is all. Liar. Humans do not feed orc children. This one did. Why? Because he was starving. That is not a reason. It is the only one I have. A second voice from the doorway. Older, calmer, rough as gravel dragged across iron. Kyle. The child smells of broth and wool, not blood. A smaller orc woman entered the cabin. Older by decades. Bent at the shoulders, careful in her movements, her head tilted at an angle that said her ears were doing the work her eyes could not. Milky white cataracts covered both pupils. Blind, but her nostrils worked the air like fingers reading a page, sampling the cabin's inventory of smells and cataloging each one. Wood smoke, iron, coffee, sweat, wool, broth, the particular chemical signature of a child who had been fed and warmed and not harmed. Kyle, the old woman's voice carried the weight of someone who had earned the right to use a single name as a complete sentence. A name that meant stop. A name that meant think. A name that meant I have lived longer than you and I am telling you something. He could have cleaned him, Kale said, the knife still at Garrett's jaw, covered the marks. There are no marks to cover, Tisha, the blind woman replied. She had stopped in the center of the cabin, her head turning slowly, reading the room through channels Garrett could not see. A man who takes children does not leave his door open. This door was open. That means nothing. It means everything. A closed door hides, an open door invites inspection. This man's door was open when we arrived. That is not the behavior of someone who has something to conceal. The third woman appeared in the doorway behind them, younger, slimmer, one arm held against her chest in a makeshift sling torn from what had once been a decent wool shirt. She leaned against the frame, breathing hard from the climb, her face drawn tight with the particular gray of someone managing pain they had stopped acknowledging days ago. She said nothing. Her eyes moved across the cabin, across Garrett, across the child in the corner, across the knife at Garrett's jaw, and filed everything in a place behind her expression that gave nothing back. Cale's arm pressed harder against Garrett's throat for one beat. Two. Then she stepped back. He slid down the wall, rubbing the bruised skin, coughing. The air tasted better when it came without a forearm across the windpipe. If you are lying, Cale said, I will know, and I will come back. I am not lying. Everyone lies. Then check the boy yourself. Cale's face cracked. Not softened. Cracked the way stone cracks when water has been working at it from inside for years. She turned from Garrett and knelt on the cabin floor. Her arms open, the knife transferred to her other hand, but not put away. A mother's arms open, a warrior's hand still armed. Both things true at the same time. Come here, baby. The child crossed space between them slowly. Not running, not the desperate sprint of a child reunited with safety. Something more cautious. Something that said, I know you, but I have been alone long enough that knowing someone is not the same as trusting them. He pressed his face into her shoulder. No crying, no sound, just contact. A body remembering what it felt like to be held by the specific person who was supposed to hold it. Cale ran her hands over his arms, his ribs, his legs, checking, finding nothing broken, nothing bleeding, nothing that matched the horror she had been preparing herself for across 4 days of tracking through frozen wilderness with a blind woman and an injured companion. He is thin, she said. The word carried accusation and relief in equal measure. He was thinner when I found him, Garrett replied from the floor. 4 days, Cale said. We tracked him for 4 days, through 2 passes and a frozen creek crossing. He found my cache on day 1, bit me on day 2. He bit you. Forearm, through the sleeve. Cale's mouth twitched. The smallest motion, almost invisible. The ghost of something that might have been pride. That is my boy. The blind woman had made her way to the stove by touch. Her fingers spread across its surface, reading the heat the way a person might read a letter, each zone of warmth, a different word in a sentence about the fire's history. This fire burned all night, she said, for 1 man and 1 child. That is generous heat for 2. I keep it hot, Garrett said. You keep it hot for him. Not a question. An observation from a woman who had spent a lifetime learning to hear the truth underneath the words people chose. The wind outside had changed. Garrett could hear it shifting the pitch, dropping the way it did when weather was coming in fast from the northwest. He looked past the younger woman in the doorway to the sky beyond. Dark, heavy, moving, a sky that meant business. And Kyle was already packing her son against her hip knife, in the other hand eyes on the broken door that hung crooked on its one remaining hinge. We are leaving, she said, as soon as it eases. But Garrett watched the sky, and the sky said nothing was easing. Not today, not tonight. The storm that was building beyond the ridge had the weight of something that intended to stay. Have you looked outside, he said. I have walked through worse. With a child on your hip. And her. He nodded toward the blind woman, in a blizzard, on trails with no markers. Marin manages fine, Cale said. The name came out sharp, defensive, the tone of someone who had been told too many times that the people she protected were liabilities. Marin can speak for herself, the old woman said from beside the stove. And Marin says the human has a point. The past will be buried by nightfall. We are not dying out there because you are too proud to wait. We are not staying here. Choose your stubbornness carefully, girl. The younger woman shifted against the doorframe, silent, her face gray with pain she was no longer able to hide. Garrett looked at her arm in the sling and saw what Cal had been too focused on her son to notice. The fingers extending from the makeshift wrap were not the right color. They were gray at the tips, not the gray of cold, the gray of tissue that was running out of time. Your arm, he said to the younger woman. When did it break? Silence. Her eyes flicked to Kyle, then back to Garrett. A quick negotiation behind the irises about who had the authority to answer this question. 3 days ago, Marin answered for her. A fall on the ridge crossing. It needs setting. We know what it needs, Cale cut in. Then why has it not been done? We tried. She passed out from the pain. Because it was done wrong. The bones shifted. and you are suddenly a healer. I am a man who has broken his own collarbone and 2 fingers and set them both alone in a cabin with no help and no one to hear me scream. I know what a bad set feels like. I know what happens when bone sits wrong for too long. Kale crossed her arms. What happens if we do not fix it? She loses the arm. Maybe more. Bone cuts off blood. Blood stops reaching the fingers. Fingers die. Then the hand. Then everything below the break. It does not stop on its own. Her jaw tightened. She crossed the cabin and took the younger woman's hand, turned it over, studied the fingertips the way a soldier studies a wound on the field, calculating what can be saved and what is already lost. How long have they been that color? Kale asked. Since yesterday, the younger woman said quietly. Her name was Sable. Garrett would learn that later. For now, she was just a woman in a doorway with an arm that was dying while the people who loved her argued about whether to trust the stranger offering to save it. Why did you not tell me? You had enough to worry about. Kale turned back to Garrett. Her jaw worked like she was grinding something between her teeth that would not go down. Something that tasted like pride and fear, and the particular bitterness of needing help from exactly the kind of person she had spent her whole life learning not to trust. If you hurt her, she said, then you have a knife and I have a bad door. We both know how that ends. Kyle, Marin's voice from beside the stove. Final, the voice of a woman who had outlived enough arguments to know when one needed to stop. Let him. He is a human. He is a human with splints and a warm stove. She needs both. Kale held Garrett's gaze. Hostile, measuring, running calculations behind those black eyes that had nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with the accumulated weight of every interaction she had ever had with his kind. Burned camps, driven families, children who disappeared. A lifetime of evidence that said humans were not safe arranged in neat rows like bones beside a cash pit. Then she faced Sable. Your choice. Sable straightened against the doorframe. Her good hand gripped her broken arm. She looked at Garrett for a long time, searching his face for something specific. Some particular arrangement of features that would tell her whether the hands he was offering would heal or harm. Whatever she found there was apparently enough. It was not trust. It was something smaller and more practical, a willingness to bet that this time would be different from all the other times. She nodded once. Do it. The snow fell harder. The wind drove flakes sideways through the broken door until the cabin floor was dusted white, and the cold had crept from the entrance to the center of the room. Garrett moved to the workbench and gathered what he needed. Straight sticks from the kindling pile, the straightest ones he could find, ones that would hold weight without bending. Leather strips cut from an old belt he had been meaning to throw away for 2 years. Clean cloth torn into strips. He laid them on the floor beside Sable with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, alone biting down on his own belt in a cabin where no one would have heard him if he had screamed for hours. This is gonna hurt, he said, kneeling beside her. I know what hurt feels like. Bite down on this. He handed her a leather strap. Thick, scarred from his own teeth, though she could not know that. She took it. Their fingers touched. His rough from 3 years of traps and axes and stove grates. Hers cold from 3 days of carrying a broken arm through mountain passes, where the wind never stopped and the pain never dimmed. On 3, he said. He set it on 1. Sable screamed into the leather. Bone ground against bone as it moved back into position. The sound was worse than the scream. The particular wet grinding of something being forced where it had already decided it did not want to be. Kale's hand went to her knife. Marin's fingers tightened on the stove. Even Ren flinched in his corner, the blanket pulled up to his eyes. Done, Garrett said, tying the splints firm with steady hands that did not shake because he would not allow them to. Sable panted, eyes bright with pain, and something that was not pain. The leather strap dented deep with tooth marks. She pulled it from her mouth. You said 3. Nobody who says 3 means 3. That is a terrible method. Works, though. She flexed her fingers. They moved. All 5, slow and painful, but alive. The gray at the tips already looked different. Not healed, but not advancing. The blood was finding its way back. Outside, the storm closed the mountain. Snow erased the trails. Snow buried the boot prints by the tree line, the military tread that Garrett had memorized and told no one about. Snow covered everything the way it always did, hiding what was underneath, until the thaw came and revealed what had been there all along. Inside the cabin, 5 people who had not chosen each other breathed the same air and listened to the stove tick and waited for something none of them could name. Kale held her son. Marin read the fire with her fingers. Sable flexed her newly set hand, and Garrett sat at his workbench with his back to all of them, sharpening a blade he did not need sharpened, because it gave his hands something to do while his mind worked through the simple arithmetic of the situation. One man, one cabin, one winter's worth of food for one person, and four strangers who had walked out of the same kind of fire that had driven him here. Ash makes the soil richer, he thought, but first you have to survive the burning. The cabin divided itself without discussion. Kael and Ren claimed the far corner. She hung a blanket from a nail in the rafter, creating a wall that did not exist but carried the full weight of a boundary. That is my storage nail, Garrett said on the first morning. Now it is a wall, Kael replied, and something in her voice made it clear the conversation was over before it started. The blanket was thin enough to see shadows through. It hid nothing. It separated everything. Marin stayed beside the stove. She had found her place within an hour of arriving and showed no intention of leaving it. Her fingers spread across the iron surface like she was reading a letter written in heat, each zone of warmth a different word. She sat on a folded hide that Garrett had not offered and she had not asked for. It appeared beneath her the way things appeared around Marin through some process of will that bypassed permission. Sable took the space near the door, her splinted arm resting on her knee, her back against the frame. Watching, always watching. The door she leaned against was the one she would go through first if something went wrong, and Garrett understood that her position was not comfort, but strategy. She had chosen the exit. That was how she managed fear. By always knowing where the exit was. He kept his cot and his workbench. The strip of floor between them was his. 4 feet of space that nobody crossed. 5 bodies instead of one meant more warmth from the stove, but less air to breathe. The cabin held a different density now. Thicker. The particular weight of a room holding more life than it was designed for. Every morning, Garrett woke to the smell of other people. Wool and skin and the faint iron scent of orc blood, which was different from human blood, in ways he could not describe but recognized the way you recognized a dialect you had heard once and never forgotten. It was the smell of proximity, of shared air, of bodies existing close enough to hear each other breathe. "You eat yet?" Kael asked Ren on the second morning. Her voice carried through the blanket wall as if the fabric were not there. "He gave me bread." "Who?" "The man. His name is Garrett. He told me Ember." "That is not your name." "He said it was until I told him different." Kael pulled the blanket aside and fixed Garrett with a look that could strip bark from a living tree. "You renamed my son. He would not tell me his real one. So you picked one. He was covered in ash. It fit. You do not name someone else's child." "I did not know he was someone else's. He was alone, starving and biting." Kael's mouth pressed flat. She dropped the blanket back into place. Through the fabric, Garrett heard her mutter something in Orcish that he could not translate but understood completely. The tone was universal. It was the sound of a mother who had been outnumbered by circumstances and was taking it out on the nearest available wall. The first 3 days set the pattern. Kael cooked. Not for Garrett, for her people. She used his stove, his pots, his salt, and produced meals that were technically his food prepared by hands that refused to acknowledge it. As extra, she would say to no one in particular, leaving a bowl on the table near his workbench. The bowl appeared as if by accident. Garrett ate the extra. He never thanked her. She never expected it. The arrangement worked because neither of them had to admit it existed. It was a treaty written in soup. "You season differently," he said on the second evening, scraping the last of the broth from the bowl. "I season correctly. You season like a man who gave up on flavor 3 years ago and has been punishing his tongue ever since. I use salt. Salt is not seasoning. Salt is desperation. Salt is what a man uses when he has forgotten that food is supposed to taste like something other than survival." "There is wild sage growing by the creek," Marin offered from beside the stove. "And thyme near the western ridge. I can smell it from here." "You can smell thyme from inside a closed cabin." "I can smell everything from inside a closed cabin. My nose works harder than your eyes ever will. Your eyes look at a forest and see trees. My nose reads the same forest and hears a conversation." Kael brought sage the next morning. How she found it under 2 feet of snow was a question Garrett decided not to ask. Some things were better left unexplained. The soup that night tasted different. Not better in any way he could name. Different. Like a room that had been rearranged while he was not looking. Same furniture, new arrangement. Something he had not known was missing until it was there. "You used the sage," Garrett said. "Marin found it. I just cooked it." He ate 2 bowls instead of 1. Kael noticed. She said nothing, which was its own kind of conversation. A silence that meant I see you eating and I am choosing not to comment, which was Kale's version of warmth. A warmth so subtle it could be mistaken for indifference, which was exactly how she preferred it. Marin was the only one who moved freely through the cabin. She navigated by memory, counting steps, trailing fingers along every surface until the wood grain was mapped in her mind like a landscape. By the third day, she had cataloged every corner, every joint, every imperfection in the construction. Your workbench has a loose joint, she told Garrett on the third morning. I know. Third leg from the left. The dowel is splitting. How can you tell? It talks different from the others. Damaged wood speaks louder, a sound that wants to be heard before the break comes. Wood warns you. If you listen. Garrett checked. She was right. The dowel had a hairline crack that he had missed for months. You build things, he asked. I remember things. My hands build what my eyes cannot see. That is not an answer. It is an orc answer. We do not separate knowing from doing. The hand that feels is the hand that makes. They are not two things. They are one thing with two names. Sable said nothing for 3 days. She sat near the door with her splinted arm and measured Garrett with a patience that reminded him of the foxes he sometimes saw on the ridge. Not aggressive, not afraid, calculating, working out the distance between safe and trapped, and deciding whether the space between them was wide enough to occupy. Her eyes missed nothing. They tracked him across the cabin the way a snare tracked movement, not with hostility, but with the focused attention of someone who knew that the difference between safety and danger was a single wrong motion. On the fourth morning, Garrett was repairing a trap spring at his workbench when her gaze shifted. Not on him, on the mechanism, the coiled metal in his hands, the tension arm, the release pin. That catch is set wrong, she said. First words in 3 days. Her voice was lower than he expected. Quieter. The voice of someone who rationed words the way the child had rationed bread. He kept his voice level. How so? The tension arm sits too high. It will snap before it holds anything heavier than a squirrel. You are wasting bait in spring life. You know traps. I know tension, physical and otherwise. Put the arm lower. Offset the pin by a quarter turn. He adjusted. She was right. Better, she said. Not praise, assessment. The tone of someone evaluating equipment, not complimenting a person. You have done this before. My camp used snare lines. Different design, same principle. Tension and release. Control the tension and the release takes care of itself. Show me the difference. She hesitated. The space between hesitation and action was where trust lived, and she was not sure yet whether the floor of that space would hold her weight. Then she slid closer to the workbench, careful of her arm, and traced the spring mechanism with one finger. Here, your release is too stiff. If you loosen this coil and add a second anchor point, the trap holds bigger game without needing more tension. Less force, more control. You are fighting the metal. Stop fighting it. Work with what it wants to do. That is smart. That is survival. Same thing where I come from. Their eyes met. Sable held the contact for a moment. Not warm, not hostile, present. The look of someone who had decided to exist in the same space as another person and was testing whether the space would hold both of them without collapsing. Then she pulled back to her spot by the door. Fix the coil. Then I will show you the snare design. Deal. Do not thank me. Your trap is going to waste bait. Would not dream of it. The 6th day. Snow still falling. The world outside had become a white wall. The trails were buried. The tree line was a suggestion rather than a fact, a smudge of dark against white that moved when the wind pushed the snow sideways. Anyone going to mention leaving Garrett? Asked the cabin. Nobody answered. That was answer enough. That night, KL sat beside the stove after Ren had fallen asleep. Marin was dozing, her fingers still resting on the stove surface, even in sleep, maintaining contact with the only thing in the cabin she fully trusted. Sable was at the door. Garrett was at his workbench. The boy slipped the perimeter, KL said. Her voice was low, aimed only at Garrett. Private. The tone of a conversation that was happening, whether he wanted it to or not. I noticed. He came to your workbench on his own. I did not send him. I did not allow it. I know. He carved a house. I saw. Kale was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind tested the walls like something measuring their strength. He does not carve things, she said. He has not made anything since the camp burned. He stopped. Stopped playing. Stopped building. Stopped being a child in the ways that children are supposed to be. His hands would not make things. It was like the fire burned that out of him, along with everything else. And then he sits next to you for 10 minutes with a dull knife and a scrap of wood, and he makes a house. Garrett said nothing. Some things did not require a response. They required witness. Why you, Kale asked, not angry, genuinely asking, searching for an answer she needed. Why would he choose you? I did not do anything special. I sat at a workbench. He came to me. That is what I cannot understand. He does not go to anyone. Not to Marin, not to Sable, not to me most days. He exists inside a space that the fire made and nobody gets in. But you did, and I do not know whether to be grateful or terrified. Both is fine. Both is all I have got. She looked at the blanket wall. Behind it, her son slept. For the first time in months, he slept without screaming. The 8th morning. The storm had paused, not broken, paused. The sky hung low and gray and heavy with the promise of more, like a man drawing breath before speaking again. Garrett took the break to check the perimeter. He found what he had been afraid of. The boot prints were back. Different location. South side of the cabin, this time near the woodpile. The same military tread. The same pattern of someone standing watching, shifting weight from foot to foot. But this time there was more. A blaze mark on a pine tree 20 yards from the cabin. A triangle cut into the bark with a knife. Fresh sap weeping from the cuts like the tree was bleeding. And another mark on the next tree. And the next. A line of blazes leading southeast back toward the lowlands. Toward the settlements. Toward the world that Garrett had left behind. He had seen marks like these before. Not identical. But the language was the same. Trail markers. Someone was mapping a route to his cabin and marking it for others to follow. Garrett stood in the snow between the blazed trees and felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. He thought about what Kyle had told him on the second night after Wren was asleep and Marin was humming by the stove. Our camp was in the northern hills, Kale had said. Montana side of the range. 30 families. We had been there 4 years. Long enough to build homes. Long enough to plant gardens. Long enough to think we were safe. The word safe came out of her mouth the way a person says the name of someone who died. With distance. With the particular care you give to a word that used to mean something and no longer does. They came at night, men with torches and rifles and a name they had given themselves. Ashguard, as if guarding the ashes was something noble. As if burning people out of their homes was a civic duty that required a title. They did not just burn the camp. They marked the survivors. Tracked them. Followed the ones who ran to make sure the running never stopped. Because the burning was not the point. The point was the message. The point was that nowhere was safe, and no distance was far enough, and no hiding place was deep enough. Standing in the snow, looking at the blaze marks on the trees, Garrett understood. The boot prints from before the storm were not random. They were reconnaissance. And the marks on the trees were not trail signs for hunters or trappers. They were directions. A map drawn in sap and bark that said, this way, this is where they are hiding, this is where you will find them. He scraped the marks from the trees with his knife. Every one he could find. Then he checked the ground for tracks and found them leading southeast, partially filled by new snow but still readable. 2 sets of boots, moving together, moving with purpose. When he returned to the cabin, Kyle was feeding Wren by the stove. She looked up. Her eyes read his face the way Marin read surfaces, looking for what was underneath. You were gone longer than usual, checking the perimeter, and he considered lying. Considered keeping this to himself the way he had kept the first set of boot prints to himself, protecting them from a fear they did not need yet. But Kyle was not someone you protected from the truth. She was someone who had survived the truth repeatedly and would rather face it armed than be surprised by it unarmed. We have a problem, he said. He told her about the boot prints, the blaze marks, the trail leading southeast. He told her what he thought it meant, and he watched her face as he said it, and what he saw was not surprise. It was recognition. The face of someone hearing a sound they had been waiting to hear, a sound they had hoped would not come, but had known all along would arrive eventually. Kale's face went still. Not the blankness of shock, the stillness of someone whose body had already started preparing for what came next. Her hand found the knife at her belt. Her eyes moved to Wren, then to Marin, then to Sable, then to the door. 4 points on a map of everything she was responsible for keeping alive. How long, she asked. Before the storm, the first prints were here. They have been back since. The blaze marks are fresh. maybe 2 days old. How many? 2 sets of tracks. But they are scouts. The ones who follow will be more. Kale stood. The cabin felt smaller. We run, she said. Tonight. North through the back passes. In a blizzard? With a blind woman, a 5-year-old, and 2 people with injuries that are not healed. I have moved through worse and lost people doing it. The question hit something. Kale's jaw tightened. Her hand squeezed the knife handle until her knuckles went dark. You do not get to ask me that. I get to ask because I am the one who has to help bury them if it goes wrong. Those passes are buried under 4 feet of snow. No markers, no trail, night temperatures that will kill a child in 2 hours. I have lived on this mountain for 3 years. I know what it does to people who underestimate it. Then what? She stepped closer. Her voice was a blade. We sit here and wait for them to come. No, we prepare for them to come. Garrett crossed to his workbench. He pulled out the box where he kept his trap components. Springs, wire, pins, release mechanisms. 3 years of parts accumulated for a trap line that fed one person. More parts than he needed. He had always kept more than he needed because excess was how a man alone on a mountain stayed alive through the months when nothing worked. I know this mountain, he said. Every trail, every choke point, every place where the terrain forces movement into a narrow path. And I know traps. That is the one thing I am good at. I can turn the approaches into something that will slow them down, hurt them, make them think twice about pushing through. Traps, Kale said. The word carried the weight of disbelief. You want to fight a group of armed men with traps. I want to make the cost of reaching this cabin higher than they are willing to pay. Sable was on her feet. She had been listening from the door, her body still but her mind moving faster than anyone in the room could track. Her eyes were sharp, her splinted arm held close. The snare design, she said, the one I showed you. It can be scaled up, heavier wire, stronger anchor points. Set at knee height on a narrow trail, it will take a man down hard enough to break bone. You are talking about weaponizing hunting traps. I am talking about surviving. I have been surviving my entire life. The tools change, the principle does not. Kale looked between them, the human and the orc, the trapper and the snare builder. Something passed across her face that Garrett could not read, something complicated and unwelcome. Then she nodded. Show me what you need. They worked through the night, Garrett and Sable at the workbench, shoulder to shoulder, designing trap configurations that had nothing to do with catching rabbits. Her snare design was elegant in a way his traps were not. Where he built for force, she built for precision. She understood tension the way a musician understood strings. She knew how much pressure a joint could take before it gave, how far a wire could stretch before it snapped, how to balance opposing forces so that the mechanism held itself in check until the exact moment it was needed. Together, the combinations were brutal, effective, the kind of engineering that emerged when 2 different kinds of knowledge merged. Kale sharpened stakes outside the door, her knife working in the cold with a rhythm that said she had done this before. She did not ask questions. She did not need instructions. She was a woman who had survived the burning of her home and the loss of her people, and 4 days of tracking through frozen wilderness, and the prospect of another fight was not something she feared. It was something she had been expecting. Marin sat by the stove with Ren, her fingers moving over the child's hands, teaching him to read surfaces by touch, while the adults prepared for war outside the blanket wall. The boy did not know what was happening. Or maybe he did. He had survived alone for weeks. 5-year-olds who survive alone for weeks know more than anyone gives them credit for. By morning, they had 12 mechanisms ready, trip lines, spring snares, a deadfall weighted with the heaviest stones Garrett could carry from the creek bed. They set them on the 3 approach trails, the paths that any group moving from the southeast would have to use to reach the clearing where the cabin sat. Garrett worked until his hands bled. The wire cut his palms. The cold made the cuts feel like fire. Sable worked beside him, her good arm doing what 2 arms should, improvising, adapting, finding solutions that Garrett would not have seen alone. She designed a new mechanism for the narrowest choke point on the southeast trail, a trip line connected to a counterweight that would swing a log at chest height across the path. Brutal, efficient, the kind of thing that ended a confrontation before it became one. This will not stop them, Kale said, standing over the last trap as Garrett buried it under leaves and snow. It will slow them. And slow might be enough. Enough for what? Enough for them to decide this cabin is not worth the cost. Kale looked at him. Men like that do not decide things are not worth it. They decide things cost more, and then they come back with more men. Then we will deal with more men when they come. Right now, we deal with what is in front of us. Garrett straightened. His ankle caught a root hidden under snow and ice and frozen mud. He went down hard, a wet grinding sensation in the joint, the particular feeling of something stretching past its limit and tearing. Not bone, ligament, tendon, something soft that held hard things together, and when it gave, the hard things shifted in ways they were not supposed to. He grabbed a tree trunk, pulled himself up. The ankle held weight but screamed against it. Every step was a negotiation between his body and the ground was winning. Stupid, he muttered. Half a mile from the cabin, on a slope, alone with a sprained ankle in a forest full of traps he had just set himself. A sound behind him. Small, deliberate, bare feet on frozen ground. The particular sound of a child who had learned to move through a forest without breaking a single twig, except when he wanted to be heard. Wren appeared between two pines. Eyes wide, the blanket wrapped around his shoulders like a cloak. He had followed again. The shadow habit he had developed, trailing Garrett at 15 paces whenever the man left the cabin, matching stops and starts with a shadow's precision. You fell, Wren said. I noticed. Your foot is wrong. Also noticed. Can you walk? The boy studied him with that calculating expression, the one that belonged to someone much older. The expression of a mind that had learned to assess situations quickly because slow assessment had consequences. Then he bolted, fast, soundless, vanishing through the trees in the direction of the cabin. Garrett waited. The cold settled deeper. His ankle throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat. 10 minutes. 15. The cold found the swelling and squeezed it. Then footsteps returned, heavier this time, multiple. Kale appeared on the trail, Wren at her heels. Sable behind them, both one-armed, breathing hard from the climb. He says you fell, Kale said, kneeling beside him. The boy has a gift for observation and a complete inability to stay where he is told to stay. Can you stand? If someone lends a shoulder, Kale hooked her arm under his without hesitation. Practical, not tender. The grip of someone who had carried wounded people before and knew where to hold and how much weight to take. You are heavier than you look, she said. Mostly coat, mostly stubbornness. Sable moved to his other side. Her good arm braced against his ribs, her splinted arm pressed against his back. She could not grip, but she could stabilize. She could be a wall for him to lean against, and walls did not need hands. Lean on me, Sable said. Your arm is fine. It holds because you said it right. Lean. He leaned. They moved down the slope together. 3 people locked in a formation that was equal parts rescue and controlled fall. Wren walked ahead, kicking stones from the path, moving branches, clearing the way with bare feet that seemed immune to cold. He does that, Kyle said, watching the boy work. Clears the way. Started doing it after the fire. He would walk ahead of us on trails and move everything that could trip us. Branches, rocks, ice. As if he believed that if the path was clear enough, nothing bad could follow. How old was he when the camp burned? 4. Garrett let that settle. 4 years old. A child who had learned to clear paths for the people behind him because the last time a path was not clear, everything burned. He does not remember it the way we do, Kale continued. He remembers the hiding. 2 days under branches, not moving, not breathing louder than the wind. He told me. 3rd night, during a nightmare. Kale's grip on his arm tightened. Not pain, something else. Something that lived between gratitude and jealousy and could not decide which one it wanted to be. He told you, she repeated. He does not talk about it. Not to me, not to Marin, not to anyone. He talked to you. Garrett had no answer for that. Some connections formed in places that logic could not reach. A child and a stranger both burned by the same kind of fire, finding each other in the space between screaming and silence. I do not know if that makes me grateful or angry, Kale said. Both is fine. Both is all I have got. They reached the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney. Marin had kept the fire going without being told. She always did. The stove was her territory, and she defended it the way Kale defended Wren, with absolute authority and no negotiation. Ankle, the old woman said as they came through the door. She had heard the uneven footsteps from 30 yards away. Sprained. Sit. Kale unwrapped his boot. The ankle was swollen, purple and hot to the touch. Not broken, Kale said, but you are off your feet for a week. I have traps to check, the new ones and the old line. Then I will check them. You do not know the line. The boy does. He has been following you for days. Garrett glanced at Wren, who stood beside the stove wearing the expression of someone who had been volunteered for a job he had been wanting all along. You memorize my trap line, Garrett said. I memorize everything. He does, Kale confirmed. It is incredibly annoying. How many traps? 9, plus the 12 new ones. The first one is by the Split Rock northeast, then the Creek Bend, then the Dead Oak with the... All right, I believe you. Wren almost smiled. Not quite, but the muscles were heading in that direction. It was the first time Garrett had seen anything close to joy on that face. A small thing, the size of a crack in a wall that lets light through. But light was light, and even a crack was enough to change a room. That night, Sable changed his ankle wrap. Her one good hand worked the cloth slowly. Precise, the same attention she had given the trap spring days earlier. Mechanical focus applied to human skin. He did not have to come up the hill, Garrett said, meaning Wren. He did not have to set my arm, Sable replied, meaning Garrett. That is different. How? You were in pain. So were you. Just took you longer to admit it. Her fingers brushed the swollen skin as she tucked the wrap edge. The touch was clinical. The pause that followed it was not. One breath where her hand stayed. 2 breaths. A hesitation that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the fact that this was the first time she had touched someone gently and longer than she could remember. Hands that had built snares and carried injured arms and gripped knives were not accustomed to being gentle. Gentleness was a skill she had forgotten, and the remembering was slow. Does that hurt? She asked. Yes. Good. Means the blood is flowing. She pulled back, set the remaining cloth on the floor, returned to her spot by the door. Do not make it a habit, she said over her shoulder. I have only got one good arm. Noted. Wren crossed the cabin and set something on Garrett's workbench. The carved wooden house. But different now. A second shape beside it. Rougher, taller, a figure standing next to the house. What is that one? Garrett asked. A person. Which person? Wren shrugged with the devastating casualness of a child who knew exactly what he meant and was not going to explain it. Then he returned to his mother behind the blanket wall. Garrett held the carving in the lamplight. A house and a person, made by hands that had not made anything since fire took everything. He set it on the workbench where he could see it from his cot and lay down with his ankle throbbing and the stove ticking and 4 other people breathing in a space built for one. The 9th morning, Garrett's ankle kept him in the chair. Wren ran the trap line with Kale. The boy navigated from memory. Every marker, every fork, every buried root that could catch a foot. He moved through the forest with the certainty of someone who had mapped it by following another person's footsteps until the map lived inside him, until the trail existed in his legs as much as it existed in the ground. He checked all 9 Kyle reported when they returned. Snow on her braids, color in her cheeks that the cold had put there. 2 rabbits. One of them got tangled wrong. He reset it himself. He reset a trap. With his hands, no tools. He is 5. He has been surviving alone for weeks. 5 does not mean the same thing after that. While Kyle and Wren were out on the line, Marin taught the boy something new. He had brought a pine cone from the trail and pressed it into the old woman's hands. She held it to her nose, smelled it, then ran her fingers along the scales with the slow deliberation of someone reading a page written in a language only she could speak. This grew near water, Marin said. The scales are softer. Pines near water hold moisture differently. The wood remembers where it came from. How can you tell? By touching, Wren asked. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her, his face tilted up, his yellow-green eyes fixed on her blind ones. 2 different kinds of seeing, neither one complete, both reaching for the same understanding. How can you tell? By looking. Because I see it, and I feel it. Same information, different door. Your eyes and my fingers walk into the same room. We just use different entrances. Close your eyes, Marin said. Why? Because your eyes are loud. They drown out everything else. They shout so loud that your fingers cannot hear themselves think. Wren closed his eyes. His small fingers moved over the pine cone. Slowly at first, then with increasing attention. The focus of someone discovering that the world had a second layer underneath the one he had always relied on. It is warm on one side, he said, cold on the other. The warm side faced the sun, and the bottom is rough. That is where it sat on the branch. Every living thing carries the shape of where it came from. The tree carries the mountain. The pine cone carries the tree, and you carry everything you have walked through. It is all written on you if someone knows how to read it. Garrett watched from his chair. The old woman and the child heads bent together over a pine cone, trading knowledge through touch. Marin's blind eyes and Wren's closed ones, both finding the same truth by different roads. She does not teach everyone, Sable said quietly from beside the door. Only the ones she thinks are worth it. And Wren is worth it. Wren survived 2 days under branches without moving. He walked alone for weeks. He found food and built fires and stacked bones in rows to keep himself sane. Sable adjusted her splinted arm. Marin says the ones who survive are not always the strongest. They are the ones who pay attention. That afternoon, Marin asked Garrett to sit beside her at the stove. The request was unusual. She normally occupied that territory alone, a blind queen on an iron throne, and visitors were not invited. You carry guilt, she said. His hands paused on the knife he was sharpening. Everyone carries something. Yours is specific. I can smell it. You can smell guilt. I can smell a man who sleeps badly, eats less than he should, keeps his distance from people who are 3 feet away. That is guilt or grief. And grief has a different weight. Grief is heavy. Guilt is sharp. You carry the sharp one. Maybe it is neither. Then tell me what it is. Garrett set the knife on the workbench. The stove ticked. Behind the blanket wall, Wren was sleeping. Kale was outside checking the defensive traps. Sable was at the door. I had a town, he said. Coldwell. Small place. 200 people. Had my own forge. Built everything metal in that town from the time I was 15 until the time I was 50. Had Marin repeated. The word hung between them. An orc family came through on the trade road. Mother. 2 kids. Town council voted to drive them out. I said no. 1 man against a council. 1 man against everyone. They burned my workshop, then my house, then they stopped seeing me. Because you defended orcs. Because I refused to hurt them. There is a difference. Marin's fingers tapped the stove surface. A slow rhythm. Like counting. Like the beat of something deciding whether to start or stop. And the family, the orcs you defended, gone. Moved on. Did not even know what I lost for them. Never came back. Never sent word. They were strangers when they arrived and strangers when they left. And everything I lost for people who would not recognize me if they passed me on a road. So you lost everything for strangers who gave nothing back. That is about the shape of it. And now 3 more orc strangers are in your cabin, eating your food, using your stove, breaking your door. I noticed. Do you regret it, Coldwell? All of it. Every winter when the cold gets bad and the cabin gets small, and I remember what it felt like to have a workshop with a proper forge, a real anvil, iron that sang when you hit it right. He picked up the knife again. But I do not regret saying no. I would say it again, even knowing what it cost, especially knowing. Marin nodded slowly, her blind eyes aimed at something beyond the wall, beyond the mountain, beyond anything that existed in a space the sighted could reach. You are not kind, Garrett. Kind men give because it feels good. You give because the alternative makes you sick. That is different. Is that better or worse? It is rarer. And rarer things matter more because there are fewer of them. The blanket moved. Kale appeared. Her face said she had heard everything. She stood in the gap between the blanket wall and the stove. Her arms crossed her expression, working through something complicated that did not want to be expressed and could not stay contained. You lost your home, she said. For orcs you did not know. Yeah, and now you live alone on a mountain because humans punished you for being decent. That is one way to put it. I have spent every day since I arrived hating you, she said, because you are human and you had my son. I was ready to kill you the moment I walked through that door. I know. And now you are telling me you are here because you tried to help people like me and your own kind threw you out for it. I am not telling you anything, Marin told you. Then I heard. Kale uncrossed her arms, a small movement. But Garrett had lived alone long enough to read what bodies said when mouths refused to speak. The uncrossing of arms was a gate opening. Not wide, not welcoming, but no longer locked. You still rename my son, she said. He still bit me. We are not even. We do not have to be. Something shifted in the cabin that had nothing to do with the stove or the wind or the positions of 5 bodies in a space built for one. It was the particular shift that happens when hostility loses its foundation and has not yet found anything to replace it. An empty space where certainty used to be. Uncomfortable. Necessary. The first real clearing in a forest that had been too thick to walk through. The thaw started on a Tuesday, water dripping from the eaves by mid-morning. Icicles thinning along the roofline, releasing drops that hit the frozen ground with the sound of a clock counting down. The creek ran again, carrying meltwater that tasted like iron and smelled like the mountain waking up after months of holding its breath. Garrett tested his ankle outside the cabin door. Weight on it. Shift. Hold. You are limping, Sable observed from the step. Slight limp. Limp is limp. I prefer adjusted gait. I prefer honesty. My ankle is better. Not healed. Better. Then let me come with you. Your arm is almost healed. Thanks to someone who lied about counting to 3. That system works. That system is criminal. They walked the trap line together, not side by side, Sable slightly behind her eyes on the ground while Garrett scanned the trees. They moved in complementary patterns without planning it. Two people who had learned to watch for danger from different angles covering each other's blind spots, the way the land covered itself after fire. Your snare design, Garrett said at the third trap. I tried it on the hunting line, caught a fox yesterday. I know, I heard Kale skinning it last night. You could hear that from inside the cabin. I could hear her complaining about the knife being dull, which means skinning. Marin is not the only one with sharp ears. Marin has sharp everything. I just pay attention. The trail opened onto the ridge where the burn patch spread, blackened trunks standing like posts in a fence that guarded nothing. Charred soil. The aftermath of a lightning fire that had passed through 2 seasons ago, and wildflowers growing thickest here. Purple and yellow pushing through the ash. Green against black. Life doing what life does when the thing that tried to kill it finally moves on. This is the burn zone, Garrett said. Sable crouched beside a cluster of purple flowers growing from the base of a charred stump. She touched them with her good hand. Gentle. The way you touch something that survived what you survived and want to acknowledge without breaking. We had a place like this, she said. After the camp burned, everything was black for weeks. Then green started coming through. Marin said the fire feeds the soil. Ash makes the soil richer, Garrett said. That is what she says. My mother said it differently. She said fire does not kill the ground. It cleans it, takes away what is dead, so what is alive can breathe. Your mother sounds smart. She was, until she was not. They checked the defensive traps on the way back. All 12 were intact, undisturbed. The snow around them showed no human tracks. But Garrett noticed something else. The blaze marks he had scraped from the trees 10 days ago had been refreshed. New cuts in the bark. Fresh sap. Someone had come back and remarked the trail while they were snowed in. They know we are here, he said, and they are patient. Sable studied the fresh marks. Her face was calm in the way that people who have survived violence are calm before it returns. Not peaceful. Prepared. The calm of a body that has already started the process of readiness and is simply waiting for the mind to catch up. That evening, Garrett told the cabin what he had found. Fresh blaze marks. The trails reopening. What was coming? Kale's hand found her knife. She looked at Wren, then Marin, then Sable, then the door. The passes are still half buried, Garrett said before she could speak. And running is what they expect. They have marked the trails to track movement. If we run into their map. Then we fight. We are one man with a bad ankle, one woman with a healing arm, one blind elder, and a 5-year-old. You are the only one at full strength. I have fought worse odds. And won. Kale did not answer, but she did not argue either. That was its own kind of answer. The traps are set, Garrett continued. 12 mechanisms on the 3 approach trails. Sable's snare designs on the 2 choke points. If they come from the southeast, which they will, because that is where their blaze marks lead, they have to pass through at least 4 traps before they reach the clearing. 4 traps will not stop determined men, but 4 traps will slow them, hurt them, and slow and hurt men in the dark make mistakes. Kale scouted the Ashgard camp the next day. She moved through the forest with a silence that Garrett envied. No human could match it. She found them 4 miles southeast. 3 tents, a fire ring. Boot prints from at least 4 men. Rifles leaned against a tree. 4, she reported. Maybe 5. Armed. They have been there at least 3 days, waiting for the trails to clear completely, or for reinforcements. Then we do not wait for them to come to us, Garrett said. Kale looked at him for a long time. Something shifted behind her eyes. Defense does not work against men like this, she said. I have tried. We fortified our camp, built walls, set watches. They came anyway. They always come. The only thing that stops them is making the cost so high they cannot afford to pay it. I am suggesting we go out there, tonight, while they are sleeping, and we make them understand that this mountain belongs to us. It was the first time she had said us and included Garrett in it. They moved at midnight. Kale led. She knew darkness the way Marin knew surfaces, the way Sable knew tension, the way Garrett knew metal and traps. Each of them carried a different kind of knowledge, and together the knowledge was enough to navigate a black forest on a moonless night. Garrett followed, limping, his hand axe at his belt and the forging hammer from Coldwell in his grip. The only thing he had carried out of his old life. 4 pounds of iron and hickory that had shaped every hinge, every grate, every bolt he had ever made. It was not a weapon, it was a tool. But tools become weapons when the people holding them have something worth protecting. Sable stayed at the cabin with Marin and Wren. The last line. If everything went wrong on the trail, Sable and 12 traps were all that stood between the Ashguard and the people inside. She had accepted this assignment without argument. She understood that her role was not lesser. It was different. She was the wall. They were the storm. The forest was black, moonless, the kind of dark that swallowed shapes and returned only sound. Garrett followed Kale by the rhythm of her footsteps, trusting her night vision, trusting the path she chose through terrain he had walked 100 times in daylight, but could not read now. Every step was a negotiation with his ankle, every route a potential ending. But he kept moving because stopping was not an option when the alternative was waiting for armed men to reach a cabin that held a blind woman and a 5-year-old boy. They reached the Ashguard camp in an hour. 3 tents arranged around a dead fire. The coals still warm, boot prints everywhere, overlapping, chaotic, the footprint map of men who had been in one place too long and were getting restless. And voices, low, coming from the largest tent. Men awake, talking, planning. Kale held up 4 fingers, then pointed at the tents, 2 in the large one in each of the small ones. Garrett nodded, his ankle screamed, his hands tightened on the hammer. The iron was cold in his palm, cold the way it had been cold on the anvil every morning in Coldwell before the forge heated it. Cold iron waiting to be made into something useful. What happened next was not heroic. It was not clean. It was not the kind of fight that stories made beautiful after the fact. It was 2 people in the dark doing what was necessary to protect 3 people in a cabin who could not protect themselves. Kale took the large tent. She went through the canvas like it was not there. The sounds that followed were brief and ugly and ended with 2 men who would not be tracking anyone again. Not killed. Garrett would learn that later. Broken, collarbones, wrists, the specific injuries that a warrior chose when she wanted someone alive but unable to hold a weapon. The mercy of incapacitation, which was more mercy than these men had shown the 30 families they had burned out of the Montana hills. Garrett took the first small tent. The man inside woke as the canvas moved, got halfway to his feet. A big man, heavy, the kind of man who used his size as a first argument. The hammer caught his rifle and sent it spinning into the dark. The man swung. Garrett blocked with his forearm, the same forearm that a 5-year-old orc child had bitten through a coat sleeve, and brought the hammer down on the man's shoulder. The crack was loud in the quiet forest. The man went down. He made a sound that Garrett would remember. Not a scream, a surprise, the sound of someone who had expected this night to end differently. The 4th tent was empty. The 4th man was not in camp. Garrett turned. The forest behind him was dark and silent. Then it was not. The 4th man came from the tree line. He had been on watch, smart, patient, the kind of preparation that separated hunters from amateurs. He had a rifle and he was raising it, and the distance between the barrel and Garrett's chest was closing fast. And in that moment, Garrett thought about the cache pit and the bones stacked in a row, and a child who said, "All food is trap," and he wondered if the child had been right about everything. Kale hit the man from the side, full speed. The collision took them both into the underbrush. The rifle fired once, the sound splitting the night like an axe through frozen wood, and then there was struggling and the sound of a knife, and then silence. Kale emerged from the brush, blood on her hands, not hers. Her braids were tangled with leaves. Her breathing was fast but steady. The breathing of someone whose body had done what it was trained to do and was now waiting for the next instruction. "He is alive," she said, "but he will not be using that arm for a long time." She looked at Garrett in the dark. In the faint starlight that filtered through the canopy, with blood on her knuckles and her braids whirled and her breath fogging the cold air, and she looked like exactly what she was. A mother who had walked through fire and come out the other side with nothing but her son and 2 women and a knife and the absolute refusal to let it happen again. "Are you hurt?" Garrett asked. No, are you? My ankle is going to have opinions about this tomorrow. Your ankle has opinions about everything. They destroyed the camp, scattered the supplies, broke the rifles over rocks, left the 4 men alive, but disarmed and injured in ways that would take weeks to heal. Kale carved a mark into the tree beside the camp, an orc symbol that Garrett did not ask about. The men would know what it meant. That was enough. Walking back to the cabin in the dark side by side now. Not one behind the other, not leader and follower, but two people moving through the same forest at the same pace. You are not one of them, Kale said. You never were. Garrett said nothing. The hammer hung heavy in his hand. His ankle was on fire. But the weight in his chest, the thing he had carried for 3 years, the exile, the burning, the invisibility, felt different. Not gone. Shifted, like a bone that had been set wrong and finally moved back into place. It still hurt. But it hurt in a way that was moving toward healing instead of away from it. Dawn found them at the cabin, Sable in the doorway, her face tight with the particular tension of someone who had spent the night listening for gunshots and heard one. The rifle shot, she said. It is over. Sable looked at Kael's bloody hands, at Garrett's hammer, at the way they stood together in the gray morning light, shoulders not touching, but closer than they had ever been. Something in her expression changed, not softened, settled, like ground after rain. Marin was waiting inside. She had not slept. Her fingers rested on the stove surface, but they were still. Not reading. Waiting. Both of you, she said. Sit. They sat. Kael by the stove. Garrett at his workbench. Ren was asleep in the corner, the blanket pulled over his head, the carved house clutched against his chest. Marin reached out and found Garrett's hand. Then Kael's. She held them both for a moment. The blind woman's fingers were warm from the stove. Steady. The hands of someone who had held on to things in the dark for so long that holding on had become her nature. You went out there together, she said. Yes, and you came back together. Yes, good. That is how it should be. That afternoon, Marin found Garrett alone at the stove. Quail had taken Ren to check the eastern traps. Sable was outside splitting kindling one-handed, which she insisted on doing despite everyone telling her to stop. The cabin was quiet for the first time in days. Sit with me, Marin said. Not a request, a summons. Garrett sat. Their shoulders almost touched. She had never asked him to sit this close before. You fought for us last night, Marin said. I fought because they were coming regardless. You could have let us run. Stayed in your cabin, alone. They were not hunting you. They were hunting orcs. Garrett was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. Outside, he could hear the distant sound of Sable's axe, the rhythm of one arm doing the work of two. I could not have stayed, he said. Why? Because I stayed once. In Coldwell, when the vote was 12-1. I stayed and watched them drive that family out, and I told myself I did what I could. I said no. I voted. I stood up. But I stayed inside my workshop while they walked a mother and 2 children into the dark. And by the time I came outside, they were gone. That is not the same. It felt the same. It felt like a door I did not walk through. And every night for 3 years on this mountain, I have thought about what was on the other side of that door. And last night I walked through it. Marin nodded. Her fingers tapped the stove in that slow rhythm. I told you once that you are not kind, she said. That kind men give because it feels good, and you give because the alternative makes you sick. I remember. I was wrong. She turned her blind eyes towards him. Not wrong about the sickness. Wrong about what it means. You are not kind because kindness is easy for you. You are good because it costs you everything and you do it anyway. That is not kindness. That is something older. Something that does not have a word in your language or mine. She placed her hand on his arm. This cabin grew 4 people in one winter, she said. Your trap line feeds 5 instead of 1. And that boy, the one you found half dead in a cave, he carved a house with 5 plates inside. In a circle. Do you know what circles mean to us? Tell me. A circle has no head, no end. No one sits higher or lower. It means everyone belongs equally. It means no one leaves first. She tapped the stove. He did not carve a line, Garrett. Lines are what you make for guests, for people passing through. He carved a circle. That is family. Garrett looked across the cabin at the carved house on his workbench, at the 5 tiny marks gouged into the wooden floor of a wooden house by a 5-year-old boy with a dull knife and hands that had not made anything since fire took everything. I do not know how to be family, he said. I have not been anyone's family for 3 years. You have been family for 13 days, Marin replied. You just did not have the word for it yet. The thaw deepened over the next 3 days. Snow retreated up the mountain in ragged patches. Grass pushed through where white had been. The creek ran full and fast, carrying winter away. Kale packed on a morning when the sky was clear enough to see 3 ridges deep. We are leaving, she said. Garrett was at his workbench, his hands paused on the trap he was mending. When? Today. The passes are clear. There is smoke on the northern ridge. Other survivors. Other camps. We need to find them. You have been there before. No, but the smoke rises in the evenings. Someone is burning fires up there. Smoke could be anything. Smoke could be home. We will not know unless we walk toward it. Ren appeared from behind the blanket wall. He had been listening. Of course he had. The boy listened to everything. He crossed the cabin and placed something on Garrett's workbench. The carved house. Changed again. 3 figures beside it now. Rough shapes, different sizes, standing close together. And inside the house on the floor where Ren had hollowed out the interior, with the small, dull knife Garrett had given him, a circle of tiny marks. What are those? Garrett asked. Plates, Ren said. 5 of them. Garrett's throat tightened. The stove ticked. Outside, water dripped from the eaves in a rhythm that sounded like counting. Like the mountain was keeping track of the time these 5 people had left together. Ren, Kale's voice was careful, controlled. The voice of someone holding something fragile and knowing that the wrong word would break it. Come here, baby. The boy did not move. He put his hand on the workbench next to Garrett's. Small fingers beside large ones. Ash-colored skin beside weathered brown. I want to stay, he said. The cabin went still. Every sound sharpened. The stove, the dripping, the wind through the gap in the door that Kyle had broken on the day she arrived with a knife in a mother's desperation. Kale's face emptied. Not anger, not sadness. The practiced blankness of someone absorbing a blow she had prepared for but hoped would not come. You cannot stay, she said. Why? Because he is not your family. He feeds me. He teaches me. He sits with me when I scream at night. That is not family, that is kindness. What is the difference? Kale could not answer that. Not with words. She crossed the cabin and knelt beside her son, taking his small hands in her large ones. Her knife was at her belt. Her braids hung forward. Blood still under her fingernails from the night raid, the stain that soap and creek water had not been able to remove. A warrior kneeling before a 5-year-old because he had asked a question she could not fight. Ren, I walked for 4 days to find you. I broke a door with my shoulder. I held a knife to a stranger's throat. Everything I did because you are mine. Do you understand? Yes. Then come with me. I do not want to walk anymore, Mama. His voice cracked. The first time since Garrett had found him in the overhang. The first time the armor had broken and the child underneath it showed through. Not the feral creature who bit and growled and called bread a trap. The boy. Just the boy. Tired and small and done. I am tired of walking. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the cabin. Heavier than the stove. Heavier than the workbench. Heavier than 5 bodies and 13 days in a night raid and 4 broken men in a scattered camp. It was the silence of a child who had walked enough for a lifetime and a mother who had walked further, and neither of them knowing how to stop. Marin spoke first. From beside the stove, her blind eyes aimed at something none of them could see. The boy chooses. He is 5, Kale snapped. He survived alone for weeks. He found food, built fires, walked until he could not walk anymore. He has earned the right to a voice. He does not know what he is choosing. He knows he is tired. That is enough. Kale rose. Her jaw worked. She crossed to Garrett and stopped inches from his face, close enough that he could see the flecks of amber in her black eyes, close enough to see the exhaustion underneath the fury, close enough to see the mother underneath the warrior. If I leave him here, she said, and something happens to him, nothing will happen to him. You cannot promise that. No, but I can promise I will try. Same as you. Trying is not enough. Trying is all anyone has. Kale searched his face with the same intensity Marin gave surfaces, reading what hid underneath. Whatever she found did not satisfy her, but it did not repulse her either. It was something in between, something she could live with even if she could not name it. We are not leaving him, she said. The words landed in the cabin like stones in still water, circles spreading outward. We are staying, all of us. She held up a hand before Garrett could respond. Not for you, for him. Because he chose this place, and I will not take another choice away from a child who has had every choice taken from him already. The passes are clear. You said there was smoke on the ridge. I said we are staying. The smoke can wait. The boy cannot. Sable set her things down beside the workbench, in the space between Garrett's territory and Kael's, the borderland that nobody had claimed until now. I am staying too, she said. Her eyes found Garrett's, steady, honest, the gaze of someone who had been calculating distances for 13 days and had finally decided the distance was small enough to close. Not for the boy, she said. She did not finish. She did not need to. The 3 inches between two people on a step, the clinical touch that paused one breath too long, the trap designs drawn shoulder to shoulder. The way she said fix the coil and meant something else entirely. All of it was the sentence she did not finish, and all of it was enough. Marin had not moved from the stove. She had never planned to leave. I am too old for mountain passes, she said, and this stove knows my hands. Spring arrived properly in the days that followed. Garrett built a second cot, then a third, a tomam. The cabin did not grow in walls, but it expanded in purpose. A nail that held a storage bag now held a blanket wall that was no longer needed because the boundary it represented had dissolved. A workbench built for one man's traps now held 2 sets of tools. A stove that had heated solitude now heated 5. On the second day of full spring, Garrett built a fire pit outside the cabin, larger than the stove, hot enough to heat iron. He pulled the forging hammer from the step where it had leaned since the night raid and weighed it in his hand. 4 pounds of Coldwell iron, the last piece of a life that had burned. He had not forged anything in 3 years. His hands remembered anyway. Muscle and bone and 3 decades of ironwork encoded in the tendons like a language he could not forget even if he tried. He heated a scrap of steel from a broken trap spring until it glowed orange, set it on a flat stone, and swung. The sound rang through the valley, clear, bright, the sound of metal being shaped by a man who had once shaped it for a living and had stopped because the world had told him his shaping was no longer wanted. Ren came outside and watched. Kael came outside and watched. Even Marin came to the doorway and listened, her head tilted, reading the ring of the hammer the way she read everything. Through sound, through vibration, through the information that traveled through the air and arrived at her hands. He is making something, she said. Hinges, Sable answered, standing beside her. For the door. He is making more than hinges. 2 hours, 2 hinges. Proper ones forged from good steel, shaped with the precision of a man who had made 10,000 before and never expected to make another. He mounted them on the doorframe, hung the door that Kael had broken on the day she arrived. It swung smooth, it swung easy. It opened from the inside. Kael stood in front of it. She pushed it open, pulled it closed, pushed it open again. Her hand rested on the wood. You fixed it, she said. You broke it. I was looking for my son. I know. Now you have a door that works, for when you want to go out and for when you want to come back. Kael's hands stayed on the door. Her fingers spread across the grain, reading it the way Marin read surfaces, finding what was underneath. She pushed it open one more time and left it open. That said everything that words between them had never been able to carry. Sable redesigned 3 trap mechanisms using snare principles from her old camp. The catch rate doubled. Your design catches bigger game, Garrett said one morning, examining a fresh rabbit. Your design wastes spring tension, Sable replied. They worked at the bench together. Her arm healed, his ankle healed. The reasons to stand close did not require healing as an excuse anymore, and they stopped pretending otherwise. Marin taught Ren to navigate by sound and scent. The boy closed his eyes and walked the cabin, counting steps, trailing fingers along surfaces the way Marin did, reading the world through his hands. Door, he announced, reaching the frame. Good. Now the stove. 7 steps, 6.5. You are getting taller. Can I count the outside too? You can count anything. But outside is harder. No walls, no surfaces. You have to use ground and wind instead. Teach me, tomorrow, when the wind is from the west. That is the easiest direction to read. Why? Because the mountain blocks it. What gets through is cleaner, easier to separate into parts. Garrett watched from his chair. Teaching the boy had given Marin something she had not had since the camp burned. Purpose. Someone to carry the knowledge forward. A vessel for everything she knew, so that when she was gone, it would not be gone with her. She was planting seeds in the boy the way the burned hillside planted wildflowers, from ash, from ruin, from the stubborn refusal to let knowledge die just because the person who carried it was running out of time. One evening after Wren was asleep and Marin was humming something low and tuneless by the stove, Garrett sat on the step outside. The sky was clear, stars thick enough to make the dark feel crowded. The kind of sky that made a man feel both small and connected, as if the distance between the ground and the light was a space he could cross if he just knew which direction to walk. Sable came out and sat beside him, not touching, close. Close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her arm through the sleeve of her coat. Close enough that the space between them was a choice, not an accident. Marin called you a moth, she said. She calls everyone something. She called you a moth because you move toward fire even when it burns. That is not courage. That is bad judgment. Maybe. But it is the reason we are all still here. You are here because of a blizzard and a broken arm. I am here because a human set my bone on the count of one and did not ask for anything back. Her arm was free now, the splint gone, thinner than the other arm, but functional. She pulled her knees up and wrapped both arms around them. Both arms. The gesture of someone who had spent weeks unable to hold herself together and was now remembering what it felt like to be whole. Where I come from, that does not happen, she said. Where I come from, it got me burned out of my home. Then we are both in the right place, which is somewhere new, somewhere the old rules do not fit. What are the new rules? I do not know yet. I think we are writing them. That sounds terrifying. It is, but it is better than following rules that got us both exiled and burned. They sat. Stars shifted overhead. The cabin behind them held 3 sleeping bodies in warmth that had stopped being accidental. Garrett. Yeah. The carved house Wren made. The 5 plates inside. What about it? He put them in a circle, not a line. So, lines are for people passing through. Circles are for people who stay. 2 people on a step, a sky that did not care about species or exile or the distance between 2 hands resting 3 inches apart. Inside the stove ticked. Outside, the ground where fire had passed was already growing back. Garrett reached down and picked up the forging hammer that leaned against the step. 4 pounds of Coldwell iron, the last piece of his old life. Tomorrow he would use it again, and the day after that, and the day after that. Not to make hinges for a door that had already been hung. To make whatever this new life needed, whatever 5 people sharing one cabin on one mountain required to survive, and then slowly to do more than survive. Sable's hand moved 3 inches, or his did. In the dark with the stars thick and the stove ticking and a child sleeping inside who had carved a house with 5 plates in a circle, it was impossible to tell who closed the distance first. It did not matter. What mattered was that the distance closed. And out on the ridge where the lightning fire had burned everything to black 2 seasons ago, the wildflowers were thicker than anywhere else on the mountain. Purple and yellow and a green so bright it hurt to look at. Growing from ash, growing from ruin. Growing because that is what living things do when the fire finally stops and the soil underneath turns out to be richer than anyone thought possible. Not a saying, a fact. The ground where fire had passed grew back thicker and stronger and more alive than ground that had never been touched. Garrett had seen it on the ridge. He had seen it in a child who crawled out of burning branches and carved a house. He had seen it in a mother who broke down a door and then decided to stay behind it. He had seen it in a blind woman who read the world through her fingertips and found it worth teaching. He had seen it in a woman who sat beside him on a step and closed 3 inches of distance that had felt like miles. And he had seen it in himself. A man burned out of one home who had, without planning it, without asking for it, without believing he deserved it, grown another. 5 plates in a circle, not a line, a circle, for people who stay.